Welcome back to Vintage Camera Digest. Today's episode is the first in a two-part series that are all about metering, the different methods, how they work, and why you might choose one method over another. So stay tuned. When I said welcome back, I guess I'm saying that to myself as well, since I've been absent for a lot longer than I had hoped or expected. I'll bet some of you actually started checking the obituaries to see if I'd gone on to that great dark room in the sky. But the truth is that work got really busy, and there was no way I could keep up with that and keep up with this channel at the same time. One thing I've learned the older I get is just how important a balance between work and life is. Otherwise, I'm setting myself up for burnout. And this channel is something I really do enjoy, so the last thing I want is burnout. I do want to thank all of you that reached out during my absence just to check in and make sure things were okay. That really meant a lot and is a solid inspiration to keep this thing going. So thank you very much. All right, so today we're going to get started talking about metering. I've had a lot of requests over the last 6 months to talk a little bit more about the methods I use. And as I was thinking about how best to go about it, it occurred to me that it might be helpful to some viewers just to start at the beginning. Even if you're a digital user who just got their first DSLR or mirrorless camera, this will be fundamental information you can use, especially if you aspire to shoot in manual mode. But regardless of which exposure mode you prefer to shoot in, or whether you choose film or digital, this will be good info. So let's jump in. There are two basic methods of measuring the light, or metering. There is reflected light metering and there is incident light metering. Reflected light meters measure light that bounces off of or is reflected by the subject. Incident light meters measure the light that actually falls on the subject, and both types have their pros and cons. Incident light meters are usually the handheld devices you may have seen pro photographers use, just like this one. To use an incident meter, you would set it to the ISO or film speed you're using, move the meter to the subject position, and point the dome back toward the camera to take a measurement. It measures the light directly, and a lot of times that can be more accurate than the reflected type, and we'll see why that is in just a little bit. The biggest drawback to using incident meters is that they're less practical to use, since the meter needs to be placed at subject position, or at least in the exact same light as the subject, in order to be useful. Let's say you're on a hike and you come across this great waterfall. It's 100 meters away and it's lit by a sort of hazy sun. You, the photographer, however, are in a completely shaded area in the trees. So you and your subject are in two vastly different lighting scenarios. And unless you're able to physically put the meter in the same light that's lighting your subject, incident metering is going to let you down. Now, if you are also in that exact same hazy sunlight and not in the shade, you can still use incident metering. You'll just point the camera's dome back to the camera position and take your reading there. But that scenario is never guaranteed. So the takeaway from this is that incident metering is great, but it requires certain conditions. Reflected light meters, however, are what we're probably most familiar with, even if you didn't realize it, since this is the type meter used in cameras. These meters take measurements on exactly what appears through the lens and helps you achieve proper exposure based on the amount of light reflected off of your subject. And to get the most accurate results, it uses an averaging method. In other words, it measures the light areas of the scene and the dark areas of the scene and tries to set an exposure that is somewhere in the middle between those two extremes. Averaging, or finding that middle point, is going to help ensure that the highlight areas in your scene stay bright and the shadow areas stay dark. Another way to think of it is that the reflected light meters read for a middle gray. They register the brightest area in the scene, which we'll call white, as well as the darkest area in the scene, which we'll call black, and shoot for something right in the middle. So what do you get when you mix the colors black and white? Gray. The average exposure then represents the gray that is between the shadows, the dark areas, and the highlights, the bright areas. And by exposing for the midpoint between them, the meter is setting up the exposure in a way that reproduces those extremes correctly in relation to each other. Now, if that doesn't make total sense to you, don't worry, because I think it will by the time we wrap this up today. Now, this averaging method is usually pretty effective, since a large percentage of general scenes probably have a good range of tones from dark to light. You know, you've got your shadow areas here and there, and you've got your highlight areas here and there. But when the subject doesn't have this usual range of tones because it's all primarily dark or all primarily light, that's when metering problems can occur. So consider this. A camera pointed at a subject with mostly dark tones will meter is if there's a lack of light. And why is that? Well, it's because dark colors absorb light instead of reflecting it. And the meter will interpret this as having less light than there actually is. So it's going to suggest a shutter speed f-stop combination that's going to pull in more light than is actually necessary for the correct exposure. This is what it does to compensate for the apparent absence of light. In this particular situation, then, the photo will most likely turn out lighter than you expect it should be. It'll be overexposed. On the other hand, a camera pointed at a subject with mostly bright tones will meter as if there's an overabundance of light. Why is that? Well, it's because bright tones and colors reflect light instead of absorbing it. So the meter is going to interpret this as there being more light than there actually is. So it's going to suggest a shutter speed f-stop combination that will allow less light than is necessary for correct exposure. This is to compensate for the apparent overabundance of light. In this situation, the photo is going to turn out darker than you expect it to be. It'll be underexposed. The most important thing to remember is that the camera is trying to average the brightest and darkest areas to return a middle gray. And if there's little variation in the overall reflected light levels, you know, if everything in the scene is bright or white, or if everything is dark or black, the meter is still going to suggest an exposure setting based on middle gray. That's what it's designed to do, and in most situations, it's going to work pretty well. You just need to be aware that sometimes, if there's not much of a variety in overall tones, you're going to get exposure errors. So now that I've said all this, let's do a little exercise where we can see this in action. So I was saying earlier how the color or the reflectivity of your subject is going to influence your meter. So what I've got here is I've got a black card and a white card, and we're going to meter each of these separately, see what the camera says, take a photo as the camera's suggested exposure, and compare those and see what we get. All right, so first of all, I'm going to do the black card. So I'm using ISO 800 with a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second, just for reference. All right. So the camera with the black card is suggesting 1/60th of a second at f2.8. All right, so I'm going to take a photo just like that. All right. Now let's check out the white card. All right, so the white card is suggesting an exposure of 1/60th of a second at f16. All right, so take that shot. Now, you've already seen the results because I put it up as soon as we shot these. They look almost identical. And why is that? It is because, like I said earlier, reflected meters, the kind in your camera, they like middle gray. So having a subject that's all black is not terribly common. Having a subject that's all white is not terribly common. What you usually have is a mix between the two. And as I said, the camera meter is set to give you a middle gray. So whatever it is we're shooting, that's the exposure it's going after. So with the white card, yeah, it saw all of the white, but it likes middle gray, so it's going to make this middle gray. Same as with the black card. It saw all this dark area here, and it returned an exposure combination that gives us middle gray, just like we just saw. So you really have to be aware of the reflectivity of your subject. So this is a Kodak gray card. This gray is exactly the gray that the meter is after. So let's put that in the same light, fill the frame, dial in an exposure, and it's showing me 1/60th of a second at 5.6. So let's shoot that. And it comes out great. All right, so let's use that same setting to shoot the white card and the black card. So the black card at 1/60th of a second at 5.6. Wow, it looks black. 1/60th of a second at 5.6 on the white. Imagine that, it's white. So this just goes to show you that the camera's meter really likes this color, and it's going to meter everything to give you this color. Usually when there's a mix of tones, shadow to highlight, that's not a problem. It only happens when you've got an overabundance of one tone in the shot. So just be aware of that. So our little exercise just showed us that reflected meters love middle gray. That's that sweet spot between dark shadows and bright highlights. And by metering for gray, it helps keep those extremes, light and dark, in the right spot in relation to each other. But the following scene is representative of what type of scenario is likely to give you metering trouble. Here we have a snow scene where almost everything is white. There are no dark areas to balance out the tones except for this little building over here, and I don't think it's enough to be able to influence the meter very much. What you'll most likely end up with is a shot that looks something like this. Why? Because the meter is calibrated to base exposures on middle gray, and the overabundance of highlight tones fooled the meter. Now, there have been technological developments over the years to try and remedy these types of errors. For years, the overall favorite metering pattern was what we call center-weighted averaging. From the late 1960s to the early 1980s, this is what you'd most likely find on any camera. Like the name says, it measures a large portion of the middle of the focusing screen without paying a lot of attention to the corners. It was a decent system and much better than not having one at all, but it could be easily influenced by the predominant brightness of a scene, like having your subject in front of a bright window. The brightness of the window completely drowns out your subject and causes metering issues. But one of the biggest improvements in camera metering came in the form of the Nikon FA of 1983. This was the first camera to have what we might refer to as multi-pattern, evaluative, or matrix metering. The FA divided the screen into 5 sections, and it took a reading from each one and averaged those to get an exposure. The idea was that even if one of those 5 areas was significantly brighter or darker than the other 4, it wouldn't skew the overall reading in that direction because that section was equally weighted with the others. And this turned out to be such a success that all cameras would eventually use this as the default metering pattern. The big difference being that modern cameras have many more than 5 sections. The thought being that the more independent measurements you have, the more accurate the exposure will be. And I think that generally plays out as expected. By the way, different camera companies call this metering pattern different names. Some call it evaluative, some call it multi-pattern, some call it matrix. For the rest of this episode, though, I'm going to call it multi-pattern, but those are all the same thing. Now let's look at how this actually works in the camera. Any camera with a built-in meter is going to have some method of showing you the suggested exposure, and this applies to modern digital cameras the same as it does to a vintage film camera. So we're going to look at 2 different systems. One is going to be a system from a modern-ish camera, a Canon EOS-1, with LCD displays. And the other is going to be what we call a match needle system. So let's look at that older system first. This is the viewfinder from a Minolta SRT 102. At the bottom, you have your list of shutter speeds, and the brackets will indicate what speed is currently chosen. In this case, it's 1/125th of a second. At the top of the viewfinder, you have this little periscope window that reads the f-stop setting off of the lens's aperture ring. In this case, it's set to f11. Over on the right, though, is the match needle system. The straight plain needle is the indicator needle, and it moves up and down depending on the light levels. The second indicator with the lollipop shape is the follower needle. The point is to adjust your shutter speed or f-stop or a combination of both so that the follower needle aligns with the indicator needle. In this example, the follower needle is below the indicator, and that represents underexposure. So we can adjust our f-stop until they line up. or we can adjust the shutter speed until they align. Or we can do some combination of both of those. If the follower needle is above the indicator needle, it's saying that the current shutter and f-stop settings are going to result in an overexposure. And again, adjust the f-stop or shutter speed to get those needles to align. Now, since you could do either, how do you know which one to adjust? Well, that's going to depend on your subject and what you're trying to achieve. If your subject is moving and you need a fast shutter speed to keep it from blurring, you'll probably want to adjust the f-stop, since that will let you keep the appropriate shutter speed set. If you want a deep depth of field in your photo, you're going to be concerned with keeping the f-stop at a higher number. So in this case, the best thing to do might be to adjust the shutter speed instead. If we look at a more modern camera, and I use that term loosely because this is the viewfinder from the Canon EOS-1 from 1989, but it has the same design we see on most modern cameras, as all the info in the viewfinder is presented with the LCDs. Here you have the selected shutter speed and f-stop displayed at the bottom, and the meter information is over on the right hand side of the frame. And this meter can show you how many stops your exposure is off by. And every little LCD block represents 1/3 of a stop, with the whole stops being indicated by the larger blocks. In this case, the meter is showing a 2-stop underexposure. All we'll need to do is adjust the shutter speed or f-stop to get the indicator LCD to align with the middle point of the meter scale. Here it's represented by the triangular block. We can zero out the meter using only the f-stops, or using only the shutter speeds. And of course, you can use a combination of both if you like. And that, in a nutshell, is how to use your camera's built-in meter to set an exposure in manual mode. Nothing to it. Now there's one more metering pattern to talk about. In addition to center-weighted and multi-pattern metering, there is spot metering. And spot metering is another type of metering that is based on reflected light. Most modern cameras of the last 30 years probably offer some form of a spot metering pattern along with the other patterns, where matrix or multi-pattern metering pulls in a lot of measurements across the entire field of view. Spot metering does just the opposite. It allows you to meter one small area of the frame and ignore the rest. The area that the spot meter is reading is usually defined by a small central circle on the focusing screen, but not always. On modern cameras, where you're able to choose one of many different autofocus points on the screen, the area that the spot meter reads will usually follow that point. That makes good sense because the AF area or spot you're choosing is most probably what you're choosing as your subject, so the spot just follows that. Now, here's a great example of when you might want to choose spot metering over the other choices. This type of stage lighting is common with concerts, dance recitals, theater productions, and other situations where you might have small pools of light instead of a large wash. In this photo, we've got a subject that's lit by a spotlight, and most of the remaining area is unlit. Using a spot meter here would restrict the metering to the subject's area and ignore the rest of the dark areas. If we use multi-pattern metering here, the camera would include measurements from the entire field of view, most of which is quite dark. And since meters love middle gray, this is probably what you'd get. Everything washed out and your subject severely overexposed. Some cameras also have a partial metering pattern in addition to the multi-pattern center weighted and spot. Think of this as just a larger spot meter. Mostly though, it works the same way as spot does. You're choosing it because you want the meter to ignore the rest of the frame. One thing I do need to warn you about is that the camera does not default back to the multi-pattern metering once a new pattern is set. If you change it to the spot metering pattern, it's going to stay on spot metering until you change it back. If you forget to change it back to the usual multi-pattern or center weighted, you're going to have exposure problems and you'll be wondering if your camera needs repair. So just be sure to change it to something besides spot metering once you don't need that anymore. And I'm telling you this from experience. Now earlier I said that the type of meter that you can buy as a separate piece of equipment and use handheld is usually an incident light meter. Remember, that's the type that measures the light that's actually falling on the subject, not the light that bounces off, which is what we've been talking about for the majority of this episode. But you can also buy handheld spot meters. The standalone kind of spot meter is a reflected light meter that can measure a much smaller spot than that of your camera. Most of these spot meters will read an area of about 2 degrees. I'm going to get more in depth with this type of spot meter and cover some more advanced metering techniques in part 2 of this series on metering. So that will be coming up very soon. But before we wrap up, let's review the main things to remember about metering. 1. There are 2 types of metering: incident metering and reflected light metering. Incident metering measures the light that falls on the subject. Reflected metering measures the light that bounces off of the subject. 2. The meter in your camera is the reflected light type. And in modern cameras, you can choose one of several different metering patterns, which are multi-pattern metering, which is probably the default, center weighted, which you'll probably find as the only option in vintage cameras prior to mid-1980s, spot metering, and sometimes you'll have partial. 3. Reflected light meters are calibrated to that middle gray. This is fine for the vast majority of lighting situations, but if your entire scene is all light tones or all dark tones, the settings suggested by the meter will give you incorrect results, as was evidenced by that test we did with the black and white cards. So I hope you've learned something new today about metering. Like I said at the beginning, many of you probably already know this, but if you're new to photography, whether film or digital, this is good info to have and will be fundamental in understanding some of the more advanced metering techniques we'll talk about in the next episode about metering. That won't be the very next one, but it will be coming up soon, and I promise it won't be another 2 months before you see me again. So if you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and be sure to subscribe so you won't miss any of the cool episodes that are in the pipeline. I'll have the second part to this video coming up, as well as an in-depth review and photo shoot with a 1934 Zeiss Icon Super Iconta medium format camera, as well as one on the Pentax 6x7. So I hope you'll stop back by for those. And as always, I love to read your comments. This video is a direct result of some of your comments and suggestions, so keep them coming. I will see you next time.